The secret to destroying 2 lives fit neatly inside this single manila envelope. It weighed less than a postcard, but it was heavier than any burden I had ever carried. It was a paper tombstone for a marriage, a sisterhood, and the person I used to be. My sister Megan was pregnant with my husband's baby, and I decided her baby shower, that pastel-colored festival of lies, was the perfect place to announce it. Before the envelope, before the atonal ringing in my ears became the soundtrack to my life, there was light. My life was a sanctuary I had built with my own 2 hands. My world wasn't loud or extravagant. It was quiet, and it was mine. I was a NICU nurse. My job was to stand in the breach for the smallest, most fragile lives. I spent my days surrounded by the hum of incubators and the soft beeping of monitors, each sound a tiny promise of a future. I would hold hands that were no bigger than my thumbnail, whispering reassurances to babies who couldn't understand the words, only the warmth. It was sacred work. It was the only place where the gaping hole in my own life felt smaller. The hole, of course, was motherhood. It was a dream I'd carried since I was a girl playing with dolls, a dream that had become a fierce, desperate ache in my 30s. Jacob understood. Or I should say, he performed a masterful impersonation of a man who understood. Jacob was my anchor. He was charming, steady, the kind of man whose smile could convince you the sun rose just for him. We met in college, and our life together felt like a foregone conclusion, a story already written. We bought a small house with a yard big enough for a swing set. We painted a spare room a soft, hopeful yellow. We called it the nursery. For years, it was just a room full of unrealized hope. Our journey to parenthood wasn't a romantic montage. It was a clinical, brutalist campaign against my own body. It was a war waged with hormones and needles, timed intercourse, and invasive procedures. Each month was a cycle of forced optimism and crushing defeat. The injections became a ritual. The bloating, the mood swings, the feeling of being a passenger in my own skin. It was the price of admission for a chance at the dream. And through it all, there were 2 constants: Jacob's hand to hold, and my sister's shoulder to cry on. Megan, my little sister. I practically raised her. Our mother died when she was 10 and I was 13, and in that instant, I stopped being just a sister. I became her protector, her confidant, her stand-in mom. I taught her how to braid her hair, helped her with homework, and held her when her heart was broken for the first time. She was the bright, bubbly counterpoint to my quiet competence. Where I was cautious, she was carefree. Our bond felt unbreakable, forged in grief and cemented by love. She was my person. When the IVF started, she was my biggest cheerleader. She'd bring over ice cream after a painful egg retrieval or sit with me for hours, letting me rage and weep after another negative pregnancy test. Her arms wrapped around me, whispering, "It'll be our turn soon." I know it, our turn. She always said the 3 of us were a unit. That's what everyone saw. That's what I saw. Emily, the determined hopeful. Jacob, the devoted husband. Megan, the supportive sister. They were the architects of my comfort, the 2 people who could coax a genuine smile from me on the darkest days. When a cycle failed, Jacob would be the one to hold me, to absorb the initial shockwave of my grief. He'd say all the right things. "We're a team," he'd murmur into my hair. "Your body is not a failure. We will get through this." And then, the next day, Megan would show up with coffee and a plan to distract me. A movie, a walk, anything to pull me out of the pit. Their support was a perfectly executed pincer movement against my despair. I didn't realize then that it was all a performance. A meticulous, long-running play where I was the only one in the audience who didn't know the script. The crime wasn't a single, explosive event. It was a slow, creeping poison, a death by 1,000 tiny cuts. It was happening in the stolen glances over my head at family dinners. It was in the late-night text messages Jacob would delete, thinking I was asleep. It was in the way Megan started asking questions about our finances, our schedules, with an intensity that I mistook for concern. They were building their world in the wreckage of mine, and I was too consumed by my own grief to notice the construction. I remember one night after our third round of IVF failed. I was hollowed out, a ghost in my own home. I was lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. Jacob and Megan were in the kitchen making tea. Their voices were low, a soft conspiratorial hum. I heard Megan say she's just so fragile. I don't know how much more she can take. And Jacob's reply, heavy with a sigh that I now know was theatrical. I know. We have to be strong for her. Fragile. They used my pain as their excuse. They painted me as a delicate glass bird that might shatter at the slightest touch, all while they were the ones swinging the hammer. My suffering wasn't a tragedy to them. It was an alibi. It was the cover story that allowed them to fall into each other's arms, convincing themselves they were two noble souls bearing a terrible secret burden for my sake. Their affair wasn't some passionate, uncontrollable force. It was a calculated act of condescension. They pitied me. And in their pity, they found permission to betray me. The inciting incident, the moment the curtain was finally ripped away, came on a Sunday afternoon. It was early spring. The world was coming back to life, but I felt like I was buried under a permafrost of failure. Jacob and Megan had asked me to sit down. They had something to tell me. I remember the light streaming through the living room window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I remember the way they sat together on the love seat opposite me, a united front. Megan was twisting a ring on her finger. Jacob was looking at the floor. Megan started, her voice a little too soft, a little too rehearsed. There's no easy way to say this, and we've been so worried about telling you. We didn't want to upset you. Every word was a carefully chosen weapon. They were a we, and their primary concern was my reaction. They were framing their news as a problem related to my feelings, my fragility. My stomach went cold. Jacob finally looked up, his expression a perfect mask of pained sympathy. What Megan is trying to say is that something unexpected happened. Something wonderful, but complicated. I just stared at them. My mind was a blank slate, refusing to compute what my gut already knew. Megan took a deep, shaky breath and placed a hand on her stomach. I'm pregnant, she said. Time stopped. The dust motes froze in the air. The only sound was that ringing in my ears, a piercing siren signaling a catastrophe. Pregnant. The word echoed in the silent room. A word that had been my mantra, my prayer, my curse. And here it was, falling so easily from my sister's lips. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a plea for, what, forgiveness? Joy? I couldn't tell. And Jacob? Jacob just sat there, beside her, his hand covering hers on her stomach. The supportive partner. My husband. In that single frozen tableau, my entire world was revealed as a lie. My marriage, a fraud. My sister, a stranger. My dream of motherhood. A joke they were both in on. The nursery down the hall, painted in its hopeful yellow, was no longer a symbol of my future. It was a monument to my stupidity. I don't remember what I said. I think I congratulated them. I think I smiled. It was an out-of-body experience. I was watching a woman who looked like me, sounded like me, perform the final scene of her old life. They both exhaled in relief, their faces flooding with gratitude. They had done it. They had navigated the delicate situation, and their fragile little bird hadn't shattered. They had gotten away with it. That night, I went into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. And for the first time in years, I wasn't looking at a hopeful mother-to-be or a grieving wife. I was looking at a fool. The face staring back at me was a stranger, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying clarity. The 1,000 tiny cuts, the lingering glances, the hushed conversations, they all coalesced into a single, hideous truth. My first thought wasn't about divorce. It wasn't about screaming or crying. It was about something colder, something heavier. It was about justice. But what would justice even look like? There is no court of law for a crime of the soul. No legal statute for the theft of a person's reality. I could divorce Jacob, sure. The system was prepared for that. We would divide the assets. The house, the car, the toaster, a sterile procedural amputation. He would be penalized financially, perhaps. But the law has no mechanism to account for the years of my life he had hollowed out. The hope he had allowed me to nurture while knowing it was planted in poisoned soil. The law couldn't give me back the thousands of dollars we'd spent on fertility treatments that he was actively sabotaging with his infidelity. And what about Megan? What was her punishment? An awkward family Christmas? A few harsh words from relatives who would eventually be won over by the smiling baby in her arms? No, the system, both legal and social, was utterly, laughably inadequate. It was designed to handle broken contracts, not shattered souls. Family mediation would be a farce, another stage for them to perform their roles as the tragic, sympathetic betrayers who just fell in love. They would be the stars of a sad, romantic drama. I would be a bitter, childless footnote. Their crime wasn't just the affair. It was the gaslighting. It was the slow, systematic erosion of my sanity. They made me believe my grief was the problem, that my pain was an illness they had to manage. They stole my agency, my intuition, my very sense of self. How do you prosecute that? How do you get justice for a murder that leaves no corpse, only the walking dead? I realized that any conventional path would be a victory for them. It would validate their narrative, that poor, fragile Emily just couldn't handle the good news. She broke. It wasn't our fault. We tried to be gentle. No. Their punishment had to be as public and as intimate as their betrayal. Their lie was built on a foundation of my perceived weakness. Justice, then, would have to be an act of staggering strength. They had made my pain a private, pathetic secret. I decided I would make their shame a public spectacle. The idea began as a whisper, a flicker of suspicion that I had been too trusting to entertain before. Megan's pregnancy. The timing was too perfect, too cruel. It was a statistical improbability. A dark little thought wormed its way into my mind. A thought so ugly I almost couldn't bear to look at it. But in the ruins of my life, there was no room for denial anymore. A week before the baby shower, the one they were planning with such sickeningly cheerful enthusiasm, I set my plan in motion. It wasn't a grand, complex scheme. It was a single, desperate act of truth-seeking. Jacob was a creature of habit. Every morning he used the same electric razor and left it on the bathroom counter, a razor full of hair, full of his DNA. I sent the sample to a private lab, along with a sample of my own DNA for comparison, framing it as a sibling test for a fictional family history project. A lie to uncover a bigger one. The waiting was the hardest part. For 7 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my life. I went to work. I smiled at my tiny patients. I came home and had dinner with the man whose life I was secretly dismantling. I was a spy in my own home, a ghost at my own dinner table. He and Megan would call me, buzzing with excitement about the shower, asking for my input on decorations on the guest list. And I would answer, my voice calm and even, a chilling placidity settling over me. The rage was still there, but it had cooled, hardened from a raging fire into a solid block of ice in my chest. The email arrived on a Friday morning, the day before the shower. The subject line was clinical. Your results are ready. I opened the attachment, and there it was, in black and white. A string of numbers and genetic markers that translated into a single, life-altering conclusion. Probability of paternity, 999%. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there. I felt the last vestiges of the old Emily, the hopeful, trusting, fragile Emily, wither and turn to dust. And in her place, something new and terrible and strong was born. I printed the results. I slipped the single sheet of paper into a clean manila envelope. I had my weapon, and I knew exactly where I was going to use it. The baby shower wasn't just a party anymore. It was a courtroom. And I was no longer the victim. I was the executioner. I had lost myself in the pursuit of a dream they had turned into a nightmare. But holding that envelope, I wasn't lost anymore. I had found a new purpose, not to heal, but to burn their world to the ground, just as they had burned mine. Before. I tell you what happened at that party. You need to understand the wasteland they made of my life. For years, my world was a two-person rescue mission. My husband, Jacob, and my sister, Megan, trying to save me from the grief of my own infertility. While I was injecting myself with hormones, praying for a life that would not take root, they were consoling me, holding me, telling me everything would be okay. It was a lie. Their comfort was the anesthetic they administered while they carved up my life. They were having an affair. And then my sister, my sweet, bubbly little sister, announced she was pregnant. It was only when I saw my husband's hand resting on her stomach that I understood the true nature of the crime. This wasn't just infidelity, it was the theft of a dream. So I did the one thing the fragile, broken woman they thought I was would never do. I got proof. In this envelope is a DNA test. It proves that Jacob is the father of my sister's baby. They thought they could bury me in their pity. They were about to find out I was the seed. The drive to the event space took 27 minutes. I know because I counted every second. Each tick of the clock was a hammer blow against my resolve. 27 minutes to traverse the distance between the woman I was and the woman I was about to become. I had spent the morning in a state of chilling calm, selecting my armor. I didn't choose a black dress, the color of mourning. That would have been too obvious, too theatrical. I chose a simple, elegant navy blue sheath dress. It was the dress I'd worn to my last performance review at the hospital, the one where my supervisor had called me unflappable. I wanted them to see that woman, composed, competent, unbreakable. My research for this day hadn't involved stakeouts or private investigators. It had been an excruciating archaeological dig through my own memories. I spent the week leading up to the shower re-examining every moment of the past 2 years through the lens of the truth. Every time Jacob had worked late, every girls' night Megan had canceled at the last minute, it was all there, a constellation of lies I had been too blind to see. I remembered a conversation from last Christmas. Megan was complaining about her tiny apartment and Jacob, half joking, had said, "Don't worry, Meg, we'll always have room for you." I had smiled then, warmed by his generosity. Now, the memory curdled in my stomach. He wasn't talking about the guest room. My plan wasn't complex. It was brutally simple. I would walk in, I would smile, and I would wait. I would let them have their moment. I would let them perform their little play for their adoring audience. I would let the happiness in that room swell and crest until it was a perfect, shimmering bubble. And then I would pop it. The manila envelope was in my purse, a rectangular bomb sitting next to my wallet and keys. I had a speech prepared, bullet points I'd typed out and memorized, but I knew I wouldn't need them. The truth, I suspected, had its own terrible momentum. Pulling into the parking lot was the first test. My hands started to shake. The ice in my chest was beginning to crack. For a horrifying second, I thought about putting the car in reverse and just driving away, driving until I ran out of gas and then just disappearing. It would be so much easier. Let them have their victory. Let them have their baby, their life built on my ashes. But then I pictured their faces, the relief, the pity. Poor Emily. She couldn't even handle coming to the party. She's just so fragile. The thought was like a splash of ice water. The shaking stopped. I put the car in park, took a deep breath, and grabbed my purse. Showtime. The moment I walked through the door, the assault began. Not a physical assault, but an emotional one. A wave of cloying sweetness, of pastel pinks and baby blues, of forced gaiety. The room was packed with our mutual friends, our family. All people who had watched me wither over the past few years. And as I entered, a hush fell, just for a second. Every eye turned to me. I could see the pity in their faces, the awkward sympathy. I was the ghost at the feast, the living embodiment of the party's one tragic footnote. And then she was there. Megan. She looked radiant. It was the cruelest irony. Pregnancy, the very thing that had turned my body into a battlefield, had made her luminous. She was wearing a flowing white dress, her hands cupped protectively around her swollen belly. She rushed towards me, her face a mask of loving concern. You came!" she gushed, pulling me into a hug. Her body was warm, alive. I could feel the faint movement of the baby against my own stomach. My baby's father's baby. The thought was a physical jolt, and I had to force myself not to recoil. I was so worried. I know how hard this must be for you. There it was again. Her concern wasn't for me, but for the potential disruption my pain might cause her perfect day. I just smiled, a brittle, unfamiliar thing. Of course I came. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Over her shoulder, I saw Jacob. He was watching us, his expression one of pained nobility. The brave husband, navigating the emotional minefield his wife's tragic infertility had created. He gave me a small, sad smile, a gesture that was meant to convey a universe of shared suffering and understanding. A year ago, that smile would have been my lifeline. Now, it was just another exhibit for the prosecution. He walked over and placed a hand on my arm, his touch proprietary and condescending. "I'm glad you're here, Em. It means a lot. To both of us. To both of us. The casual cruelty of that phrase. They were a unit, a team, and I was the project they managed." The next hour was a masterclass in survival. I moved through the room, a smiling automaton. I endured the well-meaning but agonizing small talk. "How are you holding up?" one of my aunts asked, her voice a stage whisper. "It's so brave of you to be here." An old friend of mine pulled me aside. "You know," she said, her eyes wet with sympathy, "sometimes these things just aren't meant to be. But you're so strong." They were all reading from the same script, the one Jacob and Megan had written for them. I was the brave, strong, tragic figure. A woman to be admired for her resilience in the face of her barrenness. With every sympathetic head tilt, with every comforting hand on my arm, the ice in my chest got thicker, colder. I was an object of pity, and there is no more profound form of dehumanization. I kept a glass of water in my hand, gripping it so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. I watched them. I watched Jacob follow Megan around the room, his hand always finding its way to the small of her back. I watched the way they communicated without words, a shared glance, a tiny smirk. They were so comfortable in their deception, so confident in my ignorance. They moved through their adoring crowd like a king and queen, accepting tribute, basking in the glow of their shared, fertile future. And then came the midpoint. The moment that almost broke me. It was time to open gifts. Megan was seated in a large, throne-like wicker chair, a mountain of pastel-wrapped presents at her feet. Jacob was kneeling beside her, playing the part of the doting father-to-be, dutifully reading the cards and handing her the gifts. The room was filled with oohs and ahs as she unwrapped tiny onesies, stuffed animals, and baby blankets. I stood at the back of the room, my purse clutched in my hand, waiting for the right moment. The performance had to reach its crescendo before I brought the curtain down. Then, Jacob picked up a small, beautifully wrapped box. It was from him. "This one's a little special," he said. his voice thick with emotion as he handed it to Megan. Megan opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a small, sterling silver rattle. It was intricate, beautiful, with a tiny, perfect little bird engraved on the handle. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that rattle. I had seen it in a tiny antique shop window 2 years ago, when we first started trying to conceive. I'd pointed it out to Jacob, my voice full of wistful hope. I told him, "If we ever have a baby, I want that to be its first toy. It's a little nightingale. A little songbird. It was a secret, shared dream. A tiny, perfect symbol of the future we were trying to build, and he had just given it to my sister. He hadn't just stolen my husband and my future. He had stolen my dreams, plundered my heart for its most precious treasures, and re-gifted them to his new life." Megan was holding my nightingale. She shook it, and the sound it made, a delicate silver chime, was the most obscene sound I had ever heard. "Oh, Jake, it's beautiful," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "A little songbird for our little songbird." He leaned in and kissed her, a long, tender kiss for the benefit of the applauding crowd. In that moment watching them, I felt something inside me snap. The cold, controlled anger I had been nursing shattered, and for a second, all that was left was a raw, primal agony. It was a pain so immense, so physical, that I thought I might actually die from it. The air in the room became thick, unbreathable. The happy chatter of the crowd faded into a dull roar. The pastel colors seemed to vibrate with a sickening intensity. This was the low point. The moment of near defeat, I turned and fled. I stumbled my way to the hallway, looking for a bathroom, an escape. I felt like I was going to be sick. The mask was slipping. The unflappable woman in the navy blue dress was gone, and in her place was a raw, exposed nerve. I locked myself in the restroom, my back against the door, and gasped for air. My body racked with silent sobs. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wild with a grief so profound it felt like madness. "You can't do this," a voice in my head whispered. It was the voice of the old Emily. "Just leave. Go home. Grieve. This is too much. This won't fix anything. It will just make things uglier." I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. The weight of their cruelty was crushing. They weren't just betrayers. They were thieves of the most intimate kind. They had taken something pure and secret and sacred to me and had desecrated it in front of everyone I knew. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was fragile. Maybe this whole idea of revenge was just a fantasy, a pathetic attempt to reclaim a power I'd never had. I thought about my job, about the tiny, perfect babies I cared for every day. What was I doing here, about to detonate a bomb in the middle of a celebration of new life? It felt grotesque. Wrong. I stayed on that cold tile floor for what felt like an eternity, lost in the abyss of my own pain. I almost gave in. I almost let the old Emily win. But then another thought surfaced, rising up from the depths. It wasn't a thought, really. It was an image. It was the image of Jacob kissing Megan after giving her my rattle. It was the image of their shared smile, a smile that said, "We won. We got away with it all." And it was the image of the future they were planning. A future where I would be the sad, pitied aunt, forced to watch their perfect family grow, forever a spectator to the life that should have been mine. I would have to watch that child, Jacob's child, grow up, knowing that its very existence was the tombstone of my happiness, and the pity I had for myself curdled into something else. It wasn't the hot, messy rage I'd felt before. It was something colder, purer. It was a terrifying clarity. They didn't deserve my grief. Grief was for a loss, for something that had died accidentally. This wasn't a death. This was a murder, and they were the murderers. They didn't deserve my tears. They deserved my wrath. I stood up. I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror was not the same one who had entered the room. The grief was gone, burned away. All that was left was the ice. I smoothed my dress. I tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. I took one last deep breath, unlocked the door, and walked back towards the party. My moment of weakness was over. The trial was about to begin. I had faced the ghost of the woman I used to be on that cold tile floor, and I had killed her. She was weak and hopeful and forgiving. As I walked back into that room, filled with the sound of their laughter, I knew I was no longer a victim seeking justice. I was a force of nature, a blizzard about to descend. And I was not going to leave a single thing standing. To bring their world down, I first had to survive it. Walking into that baby shower was like walking into the heart of my own personal hell. A pastel-colored inferno of pity and condescension. They were so sure of their victory, so comfortable in their roles as the concerned sister and the devoted husband. And I played my part, the brave, tragic victim. But then he gave her the gift. A silver rattle. A tiny secret dream he and I had shared, now presented to her as a token of his love. The intimacy of that theft was a blade to the heart. It almost broke me. In the cold silence of a bathroom, I faced the ghost of the woman I used to be. The one who would have wept and fled and allowed them to win. But the pain of their betrayal was sharper than my grief. It burned away my tears and left behind something unbreakable. I walked back into that party not to mourn my old life, but to preside over the funeral of theirs. When I re-entered the room, the atmosphere had shifted. The main event of the gift opening was over, and people were milling about, plates of cake in hand, their laughter a little too loud, a little too bright. The air was thick with sugar and relief. The awkward part, the presence of the grieving, childless sister, had been successfully navigated. They had all done their duty, offered their condolences, and could now enjoy the celebration without the specter of my sadness haunting the periphery. I was no longer a part of it. I felt a profound, chilling detachment, as if I were watching the scene through a thick pane of glass. I was no longer a guest, a sister, a wife. I was a scientist, and this room was my petri dish. I observed their interactions, the social rituals, the feigned affections, with a cold, analytical eye. I saw Jacob whisper something in Megan's ear, saw her throw her head back and laugh, a genuine, carefree sound. That sound, which had once been a source of joy for me, now landed like a shard of glass in my ear. They looked so happy, so untouchable. They truly believed they had committed the perfect crime. I knew I had to act before the moment dissipated, before the guests started to trickle out, taking their witness with them. This couldn't be a private confrontation. A private fight could be denied, twisted, reframed. Jacob was a master of reframing. He could turn my righteous fury into unhinged hysteria with a few well-chosen words. No, this had to be public. It had to be undeniable. It had to be a scar carved into the memory of every single person in that room. My opportunity came when my aunt, the designated party organizer, tapped a knife against her champagne flute, calling for quiet. "I just want to thank you all for coming to celebrate Megan and Jacob," she chirped. And now I think the happy couple would like to say a few words. The room applauded. Jacob, ever the charming leading man, helped a beaming Megan to her feet. They stood in the center of the room, holding hands, the very picture of domestic bliss. This was it. This was the crescendo. Jacob cleared his throat. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice smooth and steady. "It means the world to us to share this moment with the people we love. This journey, it's been a complicated one. There have been moments of great joy and moments of profound sadness for our family. But through it all, we've tried to hold on to each other, to support each other." His eyes found mine across the room, and he gave me another one of those sad, noble smiles. "And I especially want to thank Emily for being here. Your strength is an inspiration to us all." A murmur of sympathetic agreement went through the crowd. My strength. He dared to speak of my strength. The strength it took to endure his lies. The strength to inject myself with hormones while he was sleeping with my sister. The dam of my control, so carefully constructed, began to splinter. This was my cue. Before Megan could speak, I took a step forward. I picked up my own water glass and clinked it with my nail. The sound was small, but in the expectant hush of the room, it was as loud as a gunshot. "I'd like to say something, if that's okay," I said. My voice was surprisingly calm even. Every head turned towards me. Jacob's smile tightened at the edges. Megan looked confused. "Of course, Em," Jacob said, his tone dripping with magnanimity. "The floor is yours." I walked to the center of the room, stopping a few feet from them. I didn't need to shout. I had their complete, undivided attention. "Jacob is right," I began, letting my eyes sweep across the faces of our friends, our family. "This has been a complicated journey, and he's right that in times like these we need to support our family." I turned my gaze to Megan, who was looking at me with a dawning apprehension. For years I've tried to have a baby, and for years my sister and my husband have been my biggest supporters. They were my team. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. People were nodding, their faces soft with sympathy. They thought this was a speech of gratitude. Every failed cycle, I continued, my voice beginning to harden, to take on a sharp metallic edge, every negative test. Every single time my heart broke, they were there to pick up the pieces. They held me while I cried. They told me I was strong. They told me we were in this together. I reached into my purse and my fingers closed around the envelope. I pulled it out slowly. A flicker of genuine fear crossed Jacob's face. He knew something was wrong. But a team shouldn't have secrets, should it? A team is built on honesty, on loyalty. I looked from Jacob to Megan, whose face had gone pale. You see, while I was turning my body into a pincushion, while I was spending our life savings trying to create a life, my team, they were creating a life of their own. In secret, a collective gasp went through the room. The silence was no longer expectant. It was thick with horror. The guests were frozen, their smiles gone, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. "What are you talking about, Emily?" Jacob said, his voice low and dangerous. "A warning? You're not well." "Oh, I've never been better, Jacob," I said, my voice ringing with a terrifying clarity. I took the single sheet of paper out of the envelope. "I've never seen things more clearly. For a long time, I let you both convince me that I was the problem. That I was fragile, broken. But the only thing that was broken was my marriage. The only thing that was broken was my trust in the one person I thought would always be on my side." I locked eyes with Megan, who looked like she was about to faint. My sister. Tears were streaming down her face now. "Emily, please," she whimpered. "Please what, Megan?" I shot back, my voice rising for the first time. "Please don't tell everyone how you comforted me after my last miscarriage and then went to a hotel with my husband that same night. Please don't tell everyone how you held my hand at the fertility clinic, knowing that you were already pregnant. Pregnant with the baby that my husband, my doctor, and I were all so desperately trying to conceive." The room was in chaos. People were whispering, shouting. My aunt was trying to come towards me to stop me, but I held up the paper like a shield. "You want to talk about strength, Jacob?" I said, turning my full attention to him. His face was a mask of fury and panic. "Let's talk about the strength it takes to lie to your wife's face every single day for over a year. Let's talk about the strength it takes to inject her with hormones in the morning and sleep with her sister at night. But you made a mistake. You got careless. You got her pregnant. And you thought I'd just, accept it? You thought I'd be the sad little aunt to your perfect little family?" I held up the paper. I was suspicious. So I got a test. It's funny, isn't it? After all those pregnancy tests I took, all those negatives, the one test that finally came back positive was a paternity test. I let my eyes scan the horrified faces of the crowd. I'd like to read you the conclusion. It's very scientific, very clear. Based on the analysis of the DNA loci, the alleged father, Jacob Miller, cannot be excluded as the biological father of the fetus carried by Megan Hayes. The probability of paternity is 99.9999%. A woman in the front sobbed. Another person just said, "Oh my God," over and over again. Megan let out a strangled cry and crumpled, sinking to the floor, her hands covering her face. Jacob didn't move to help her. He just stood there, staring at me, his face white with rage. He had been exposed, his narrative incinerated in a matter of minutes. I wasn't finished. I walked over to the gift table, to the sterling silver rattle. I picked it up. "And this," I said, my voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that still somehow carried across the silent room. "This was the cruelest cut of all. This was my dream, Jacob, mine, a little songbird for our baby. You didn't just steal my husband, Megan. You stole my future. You stole my memories. You are a thief of the worst kind." I let the rattle drop from my fingers. It hit the table with a loud, discordant clatter. That was the end of my speech. My work was done. I turned and walked towards the door. No one tried to stop me. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. I could feel every eye on my back, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the fallout. I didn't want to see the tears or the recriminations. I had planted the bomb, and I had no desire to stay for the explosion. I walked out of that aggressively cheerful room, out into the clean, cold air of the evening, and I took my first breath as a free woman. It wasn't a gasp of relief. It wasn't a sob of grief. It was just air. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't choking. I filed for divorce the next day. The proceedings were quiet and swift. Jacob didn't fight me on anything. He couldn't. There were 50 witnesses to his character assassination. I haven't spoken a single word to my sister since that day. I heard through an aunt that she had the baby, a little girl. I don't know her name. I don't want to. That part of my life, that entire universe of people, is dead to me. I moved to a new city. I still work as a NICU nurse, but it's different now. The ache is still there, but it's not a gaping wound anymore. It's a scar. It's a part of me, a reminder of what I survived. So, the question everyone wants to know. The question I've asked myself 1,000 times in the dead of night. Was it worth it? Did the revenge bring me peace? The answer is not as simple as yes or no. Revenge is not a balm. It doesn't heal the wound. What they took from me, the years, the hope, the innocence, that's gone forever. You can't get that back. Setting their world on fire didn't magically rebuild mine. For a long time after, there was just emptiness. Ash. The high of the confrontation faded, and I was left alone with the ruins. But here's the truth about a revenge like mine. It wasn't about feeling good. It was about reclaiming the truth. They had built their happiness on a narrative that painted me as a fragile, hysterical, broken thing. They were counting on my weakness, on my silence. My revenge was not just an act of destruction. It was an act of authorship. I took the story of my life out of their hands. I told it my way in my own voice. I was no longer the tragic footnote in their love story. I was the author of their downfall. It didn't bring me happiness, but it brought me clarity. It didn't fix the past, but it allowed me to imagine a future. A future where I am not a victim. A future where I am not defined by their betrayal, but by my own survival. The wound is still there, but it is mine. They don't own it anymore. They don't get to manage it. They don't get to pity it. Revenge didn't give me peace. It gave me silence. The silence of their voices in my head. The silence of their lies. And in that silence, I am finally learning to hear my own voice again. And that, I've decided, is worth everything.